Okay. Energy Media readers, we're going to be talking pipelines today, and with us we have Tara Houska, who is the founder, and she's a lawyer with Ginew. So welcome, Tara.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Ginew has organized a protest in Minnesota against the Line 3 project and against the oil sands in general. Why don't you give me an overview of what you folks were doing yesterday?
Sure. So yesterday was a continuation of a Frontlines ground campaign that's actually been going on for almost 2 years now, monitoring and bringing awareness to the activities of the Enbridge Corporation. So yesterday we were all at the U.S. Clearbrook terminal. So that is Enbridge's entry point of the Alberta tar sands into this region. Basically like bringing attention to the fact that, one, this is even there. Most people have no idea that the terminal exists and what terminals even look like, what a pipeline terminal looks like, with the giant containers of oil sands and all of that around, but also to make those connections between the fact that this is the Alberta tar sands and this is coming into Line 3, the proposed 10% expansion of those tar sands.
Great. So a lot of my readers will be in Alberta, and as you know, there's a lot of talk in Alberta about the need for new pipelines. So they're actually paying attention to this project. And so what is the basis on which you're protesting it? Is it concern over spills? Is it climate change? Is it land issues? What is the argument against it from your point of view?
All of the above. So, Line 3 itself represents a 10% expansion of the tar sands. So 10% of the dirtiest fossil fuel in the world, the most carbon intensive form of extraction in the world, in the face of climate change. It's the equivalent of 50 coal-fired plants being built now in 2019 and 2020. To think about the approval for that's here in North America, that would never happen. It's also, in the case of Indigenous peoples, so it goes through our people's treaty territory. It goes through several different nations along the proposed route. It poses great threats to our wild rice. Wild rice is sacred to us. It is who we are as people. So we're talking about the eradication of a culture if this spills, and pipelines all spill, as we saw with Keystone just a couple weeks ago. This is not an uncommon thing. It happens every other day.
Could you clarify a few things for me? Now, I'm reasonably familiar with the Canadian constitutional requirements in Section 35 for Aboriginal consultation, and then there's Aboriginal entitlement around traditional territories, that sort of thing. But I'm less familiar with the way that works in the U.S. So what Native American nations that are protesting, what kind of rights and privilege, or what kind of rights do they have when it comes that they can exercise around pipeline protests?
Yeah, so there is the similar. It's the right of consultation, right? So there's this demand that you have to actually consult. It is not the international standard, which is free, prior, and informed consent, which I think is a egregious law that still needs to be dealt with in the United States and in Canada, of how we treat Indigenous peoples, the original peoples of the territories. But as far as like the actual, like the legal rights as they stand right now, there is a right to obviously the reservation itself, so the reservation boundaries. And that is why a lot of these projects go as closely as they can to skirt those boundaries of existing reservations. But there's also very clearly written rights to ceded treaty territory. So the usufructuary rights, the rights to fish, hunt, harvest, in our case, actually particularly gather wild rice. It is the only grain that is mentioned in any treaty with the United States because it is that important to Anishinaabe people. So here we're talking about Red Lake, Leech Lake, White Earth, Mille Lacs Band, and Fond du Lac reservations that all have these ceded treaty territory rights to that.
Now, I'm particularly interested in this because we are having a very spirited debate in Canada right now, particularly in Western Canada, about so-called foreign-funded activists. And you've probably heard about this, where the accusation has been made by an independent, and I'm going to do the air quotes, researcher named Vivian Krause, who alleges that foundations like the Rockefellers and Tides Foundation basically put together the tar sands campaign in 2008 to oppose pipelines and further growth of the oil sands, and completely ignores the fact that the tar sands campaign was led and pretty much driven by First Nations in British Columbia and in other provinces. And so there's this myth. It's more than that. It's a meme. It's people believe it without evidence. And I'm very interested then, given that context, who makes up your membership? What are the, is it Native American led in this Line 3 protest? Those kind of questions. Give me your take on that.
Yeah, I've certainly seen some of the propaganda. I consider that propaganda that has been put out by that particular, to me, seeing someone allege that, all of this is backed by these interests that are trying to keep tar sands specifically at bay in the context of extractive energy alternatives, completely overlooks the fact that this is Indigenous led, that when it comes to the Trans Mountain Pipeline, when it comes to Keystone XL, when it comes to Line 3, it is the nations that are along these routes that are leading these fights. Here in Minnesota, which is one of the last holdouts of Line 3, they've actually begun building Line 3 around our state. The resistance is fierce, and it is led by Indigenous led either organizations or Indigenous community members or tribal nations that are suing and very concerned about the risk that these tar sands pose to our way of life. When we're out there, for us, like our small little collective, it's Indigenous peoples that are concerned about our treaty territory. It's Indigenous peoples concerned about the climate, and all of our allies that are concerned with the climate. We're not out there funded by these massive institutions. It's just a handful of us trying to scrape together crowdfunded bail money to get somebody out of jail. I mean, it's not this concerted, elaborate scheme. It's people trying to figure out, who can support this cause and who can, take the stance to actually try to stop the climate crisis.
Is there, and this may be a little uncomfortable for you, but I'm going to ask anyway. Where do the organizations that are part of, like your organization and others, are they raising money locally? Are they funded by foundations? Are they funded by big environmental groups? Could you give us some insight into that, please?
Yeah, I certainly can't really speak to the other organizations in Minnesota. So like you're talking about the nonprofit governmental organizations, so the NGOs. I'm sure there's a variety of foundations, private donors, crowd source money, like all the different ways that environmental organizations keep themselves afloat. But I know personally, we're like, we're doing a mixture of local money. So, when you go we have several different like bands and things like that are raising money at concerts to try to help us out. Fundraisers of like lunches and breakfasts, like things like that. It is literally trying to make sure that we have enough food to keep our camp going, and I don't think it's a bad thing to see that people are compensated for their time when they're out there giving up literally in often cases their freedom to continue this struggle. It's not a bad thing we pay. I'm a lawyer, lawyers get paid to do their job. Why would you not have environmental advocates that spend 100% of their time doing the complicated work of organizing and being in community and doing this heavy work, and not compensate for their time? I just don't see the connections that people try to make on that.
Sure, fair enough. And one of our Energy Media's editorial position on this is that the opponents to pipelines have the right to dissent, and they have the right to make the argument, and they have the right to protest, and they should be engaged in dialogue. And are you engaged by the company? Are you engaged by the authorities like the state or the Minnesota Utility Commission? or is this a head-to-head fight and nobody talks to each other except that they battle over the issue?
No, this is a years-long, multifaceted campaign that's involved an incredible amount of public input and communication. So with the Public Utility Commission here in Minnesota, they actually received 68,000 comments against the Line 3 project. Thousands and thousands of people have appeared giving thousands of hours of testimony in front of the Public Utility Commission. It's a I would say a well-concerted and organized effort on behalf of Minnesotans to engage in the process. There's been plenty of consultation. I myself have met with Enbridge plenty of times. I've gone to the Enbridge shareholders meetings a number of times with the same exact message, which is you do not have the consent of our people. You definitely do not have the consent of the future generations to put our survival at risk. And you need to change what you're doing. Continuing to extract from the tar sands is dangerous for us all.
Now, I've interviewed several American energy law professors, particularly Victor Flatt at the University of Houston. And Victor gave me some insights into NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, which is often the legislation under which opponents of pipeline projects will sue to stop or slow down the project. Is NEPA, and you're a lawyer, so you have obviously some insight into the process and legislation. Is NEPA is that a well-used tool by opponents of Line 3?
Yeah, I would say actually, I used to work at the Council on Environmental Quality, which is the agency that oversees NEPA. I'm very familiar with NEPA. NEPA is always in these struggles against whether it's infrastructure or a mine or whatever it is, anything that concerns the environment. There's usually, if there's enough concern on behalf of the citizens, they will use NEPA as the tool to say there has to be an environmental impact statement. An environmental assessment is not enough. There has to be a well-documented report on the potential damages that this could cause, weighing the public interest, whether this is actually in the need of the public. So here in Minnesota, the Department of Commerce actually found that it was not in the need of Minnesota to have this project, that the oil does not serve our communities. And there's this really interesting kind of situation where you've got the Department of Commerce actually suing the Minnesota Public Utility Commission. So you have the state suing itself because they don't agree about whether Line 3 is actually needed by Minnesota.
And my understanding is that a lot of the NEPA challenges, now some of them are funded by the big NGOs like the National Resource Development or Defense Council, but a lot of these NEPA challenges are funded by grassroots organization, grassroots fundraising. Is that the case with your organization and its NEPA challenges?
So our organization is not currently engaged in the lawsuits against the environmental impact statement. The last organization I was with is Honor the Earth, is an Indigenous-led organization also here in Minnesota. It's so the range of interveners on those particular cases are tribal nations, nonprofit organizations, environmental NGOs, and even down to landowners and youth climate interveners. So a group of youth that have taken it upon themselves to engage in the legal process. It is not some well-sourced effort. It's people trying to figure out, how can we collaborate? How many minds do we have on this? Can we get the support of other larger organizations that can afford it?
Now, this will be my final question for you, but it's a bit of a big one, so we may want to take some time to discuss this. But there's a sense in Canada, and I suspect it's the same in industry down there, that the environmental movement is kind of a flavor of the month. It can be defeated, it can be sort of pushed back, and it'll disappear. Whereas we have argued at Energy Media editorially that in fact the environment around linear energy infrastructure has changed, and it's changed forever. It's not going back. Anytime there's any kind of project like this, the environment around the culture around it has changed, and all of those will be difficult to get through, and they will be opposed. And that's just the new environment. It's different than what we had 10, 15, 20 years ago. And industry has not adapted well to that. Would you agree with that?
I would challenge those executives and those folks who are making those assessments that the quote unquote movement will die out, to step outside and see what's happening in their backyards, to go into the forest and find out what's actually the changes that are dramatically happening, and to see, you know, the quote unquote movement and the public awareness around not only fossil fuels but all kinds of different forms of emissions is increasing as the world is literally on fire, as the rainforests are burning, as California is burning, as we're seeing, you know, the global south all over the place going under rising seas, as we're seeing the glaciers melt and disappear and recede. It's a reflection of what is happening around us in our environment. It is not something that we can put at bay anymore and pretend like it's going to happen 20 years in the future. It's happening now. And as young people around the world are standing up, you know, the movement dying out, we have whole generations of people that are coming into this world saying, what kind of world are you giving me? You know, I don't even know if I can have children, you know, like that's what's happening. It's happening very, very quickly. The fossil fuel industry has to respond to this in a real and substantive way. That means not influencing our legislatures anymore. So like we've had multiple challenges here in Minnesota to try and criminalize protest specifically against fossil fuel infrastructure, and not trying to resist and dig their heels in to this destructive industry, but to move into a different direction, and to do so in a way that reflects justice and that is sustainable.
Tara, thank you very much for this. It's been very insightful and really appreciate this. Please keep us apprised of your future protests and so on about Line 3. We look forward to chatting with you in the future.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Tara, thank you very much.